the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. I do not mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writings. I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them. Thus, in one sense, by stating my belief that the train of thought in these lectures is Platonic, I am doing no more than expressing the hope that it falls within the European tradition. But I do mean more. I mean that if we had to render Plato's general point of view with the least changes made necessary by the intervening 2,000 years of human experience in social organization, in aesthetic attainments, in science and in religion, we should have to set about the construction of a philosophy of organism. In such a philosophy, the actualities constituting the process of the world are conceived as exemplifying the ingression or participation of other things which constitute the potentialities of definiteness for any actual existence. The things which are temporal arise by their participation in the things which are eternal. These two sets are mediated by a thing which combines the actuality of what is temporal with the timelessness of what is potential. This final entity is the divine element in the world, by which the barren, inefficient disjunction of abstract potentialities obtains primordially the efficient conjunction of ideal realization. This ideal realization of potentialities in a primordial actual entity constitutes the metaphysical stability whereby the actual process exemplifies general principles of metaphysics and attains the ends proper to specific types of emergent order. By reason of the actuality of this primordial valuation of pure potentials, each eternal object has a definite, effective relevance to each concrescent process. Apart from such orderings, there would be a complete disjunction of eternal objects unrealized in the temporal world. Novelty would be meaningless and inconceivable. We are here extending and rigidly applying Hume's principle that ideas of reflection are derived from actual facts. By this recognition of the divine element of the general Aristotelian principle is maintained that, apart from things that are actual, there is nothing either in fact or in efficacy. This is the true general principle which also underlies Descartes' dictum. For this reason, when we perceive any attribute, we therefore conclude that some existing thing or substance to which it may be attributed is necessarily present. And again, for every clear and distinct conception perceptio is without doubt something, and hence cannot derive its origin from what is not. This general principle will be termed the ontological principle. It is the principle that everything is positively somewhere in actuality, and in potency everywhere. In one of its applications, this principle issues in the doctrine of conceptualism. Thus, the search for a reason is always the search for an actual fact, which is the vehicle of the reason. The ontological principle, as here defined, constitutes the first step in the description of the universe as a solidarity of many actual entities. Each actual entity is conceived as an act of experience arising out of data. It is a process of feeling the many data so as to absorb them into the unity of one individual satisfaction. Here, feeling is the term used for the basic generic operation of passing from the objectivity of the data to the subjectivity of the actual entity in question. Feelings are variously specialized operations affecting a transition into subjectivity. They replace the neural stuff of certain realistic philosophers. An actual entity is a process, and is not describable in terms of the morphology of a stuff. This use of the term feeling has a close analogy to Alexander's use of the term enjoyment, and has also some kinship with Bergson's use of the term intuition. A near analogy is Locke's use of the term idea, including ideas of particular things. But the word feeling as used in these lectures is even more reminiscent of Descartes. For example, let it be so. Still it is at least quite certain that it seems to me that I see light, that I hear noise, and that I feel heat. That cannot be false. Properly speaking, it is what is in me called feeling, sentir, and used in this precise sense, that is no other thing than thinking. In Cartesian language, the essence of an actual entity consists solely in the fact that it is a prehending thing, i.e. a substance whose whole essence or nature is to prehend. A feeling belongs to the positive species of prehensions. There are two species of prehensions, the positive species and the negative species. An actual entity has a perfectly definite bond with each item in the universe. This determinate bond is its prehension of that item. A negative prehension is the definite exclusion of that item from positive contribution to the subject's own real internal constitution. This doctrine involves the position that a negative prehension expresses a bond. A positive prehension is the definite inclusion of that item into positive contribution to the subject's own real internal constitution. This positive inclusion is called its feeling of that time. Other entities are required to express how any one item is felt. All actual entities in the actual world, relatively to a given actual entity as subject, are necessarily felt by that subject, though in general, vaguely. An actual entity as felt is said to be objectified, quote-unquote, for that subject. Only a selection of eternal objects is felt by a given subject, and these eternal objects are then said to have ingression with that subject. But those eternal objects which are not felt are not therefore negligible. For each negative prehension has its own subjective form, however trivial and faint. It adds to the emotional complex, though not to the objective data. The emotional complex is the subjective form of the final satisfaction. The importance of negative prehensions arises from the fact that 1. Actual entities form a system, in the sense of entering into each other's constitutions, and 2. That by the ontological principle, every entity is felt by some actual entity. 3. That as a consequence of 1 and 2, every entity in the actual world of a concrescent actuality has some gradation of real relevance to that concrescence. 4. That in consequence of 3, the negative prehension of an entity is a positive fact with its emotional subjective form. 5. There is a mutual sensitivity of the subjective forms of prehensions, so that they are not indifferent to each other. 6. The concrescence issues in one concrete feeling, the satisfaction. That we fail to find in experience any elements intrinsically incapable of exhibition, as examples of general theory, is the hope of rationalism. This hope is not a metaphysical premise. It is the faith which forms the motive for the pursuit of all sciences alike, including metaphysics. Insofar as metaphysics enables us to apprehend the rationality of things, the claim is justified. It is always open to us, having regard to the imperfections of all metaphysical systems, to lose hope at the exact point where we find ourselves. The preservation of such faith must depend on an ultimate moral intuition into the nature of intellectual action, that it should embody the adventure of hope. Such an intuition marks the point where metaphysics, and indeed every science, gains assurance from religion and passes over into religion, but in itself the faith does not embody a premise from which the theory starts. It is an ideal which is seeking satisfaction. Insofar as we believe that doctrine, we are rationalists. There must, however, be limits to the claim that all the elements in the universe are explicable by theory, for theory itself requires that there be given elements, so as to form the material for theorizing. Plato himself recognizes this limitation, quoting from Professor Taylor's summary of the Timaeus. It is the presence in nature of this element of the given, this zerd or irrational, as it has been sometimes called, which Timaeus appears to be personifying in his language about necessity. A clear understanding of the given elements in the world is essential for any form of Platonic realism. For rationalistic thought, the notion of givenness carries with it a reference beyond the mere data in question. It refers to a decision whereby what is given is separated off from what for that occasion is not given. This element of givenness in things implies some activity procuring limitation. The word decision does not here imply conscious judgment, though in some decisions consciousness will be a factor. The word is used in its root sense of a cutting off. The ontological principle declares that every decision is referable to one or more actual entities, because in separation from actual entities, there is nothing, merely non-entity, the rest is silence. The ontological principle asserts the relativity of decision, whereby every decision expresses the relation of the actual thing for which a decision is made to an actual thing by which that decision is made. But decision cannot be construed as a casual adjunct of an actual entity. It constitutes the very meaning of actuality. An actual entity arises from decisions for it, and by its very existence provides decisions for other actual entities which supersede it. Thus, the ontological principle is the first stage in constituting a theory embracing the notions of actual entity, givenness, and process. Just as potentiality for process is the meaning of the more general term entity, or thing, so decision is the additional meaning imported by the word actual into the phrase actual entity. Actuality is the decision amid potentiality. It represents stubborn fact which cannot be evaded. The real internal constitution of an actual entity progressively constitutes a decision conditioning the creativity which transcends that actuality. The Castle Rock at Edinburgh exists from moment to moment and from century to century by reason of the decision effected by its own historic route of antecedent occasions, and if, in some vast upheaval of nature, it were shattered into fragments, that convulsion would still be conditioned by the fact that it was the destruction of that rock. The point to be emphasized is the insistent particularity of things experienced and the act of experiencing. Explicitly in the verbal sentence or implicitly in the understanding of the subject entertaining it, every expression of a proposition includes demonstrative elements. In fact, each word and each symbolic phrase is such an element, exciting the conscious prehension of some entity belonging to one of the categories of existence. Conversely, where there is no decision involving exclusion, there is no givenness. For example, the total multiplicity of Platonic forms is not given, but in respect of each actual entity, there is givenness of such forms. The determinate definiteness of each actuality is an expression of a selection from these forms. It grades them in a diversity of relevance. This ordering of relevance starts from those forms which are, in the fullest sense, exemplified, and passes through grades of relevance down to those forms which in some faint sense are proximately relevant by reason of contrast with actual fact. This whole gamut of relevance is given, and must be referred to the decision of actuality. The term Platonic form has here been used as the briefest way of indicating the entities in question, but these lectures are not an exegesis of Plato's writings. The entities in question are not necessarily restricted to those which he would recognize as forms. Also, the term idea has a subjective suggestion in modern philosophy, which is very misleading for my present purposes. And in any case, it has been used in many senses and has become ambiguous. The term essence, as used by the critical realists, also suggests their use of it, which diverges from what I intend. Accordingly, by way of employing a term devoid of misleading suggestions, I use the phrase eternal object for what in the preceding paragraph of this section I have termed a Platonic form, any entity whose conceptual recognition does not involve a necessary reference to any definite actual entities of the temporal world is called an eternal object. In this definition, the conceptual recognition must of course be an operation constituting a real feeling belonging to some actual entity. The point is that the actual subject which is merely conceiving the eternal object is not thereby in direct relationship to some other actual entity, apart from any other peculiarity in the composition of that conceiving subject. This doctrine applies also to the primordial nature of God, which is his complete envisagement of eternal objects. He is not thereby directly related to the given course of history. The given course of history presupposes his primordial nature, but his primordial nature does not presuppose it. An eternal object is always a potentiality for actual entities, but in itself, as conceptually felt, it is neutral as to the fact of its physical ingression in any particular actual entity of the temporal world. Potentiality is the correlative of givenness. The meaning of givenness is that what is given might not have been given, and that what is not given might have been given. Further, in the complete particular givenness for an actual entity, there is an element of exclusiveness. The various primary data and the concrescent feelings do not form a mere multiplicity. Their synthesis in the final unity of one actual entity is another fact of givenness. The actual entity terminates its becoming in one complex feeling involving a completely determinate bond with every item in the universe, the bond being either a positive or a negative prehension. This termination is the satisfaction of the actual entity. Thus, the addition of another component alters this synthetic givenness. Any additional component is therefore contrary to this integral givenness of the original. This principle may be illustrated by our visual perception of a picture. The pattern of colors is given for us, but an extra patch of red does not constitute a mere addition. It alters the whole balance. Thus, in an actual entity, the balanced unity of the total givenness excludes anything that is not given. This is the doctrine of the emergent unity of the superject. An actual entity is to be conceived both as a subject presiding over its own immediacy of becoming, and a superject, which is the atomic creature exercising its function of objective immortality. It has become a being, and it belongs to the nature of every being, that it is a potential for every becoming. This doctrine, that the final satisfaction of an actual entity is intolerant of any addition, expresses the fact that every actual entity, since it is what it is finally its own reason for what it omits. In the real internal constitution of an actual entity, there is always some element which is contrary to an omitted element. Here contrary means the impossibility of joint entry, in the same sense. In other words, indetermination has evaporated from satisfaction, so that there is a complete determination of feeling, or of negation of feeling, respecting the universe. This evaporation of indetermination is merely another way of considering the process whereby the actual entity arises from its data. Thus, in another sense, each actual entity includes the universe by reason of its determinate attitude towards every element in the universe. Thus, the process of becoming is dipolar. 1, by reason of its qualification by the determinateness of the actual world, and 2, by its conceptual prehensions of the indeterminateness of eternal objects. The process is constituted by the influx of eternal objects into a novel determinateness of feeling which absorbs the actual world into a novel actuality. The formal constitution of an actual entity is a process of transition from indetermination towards terminal determination. But the indetermination is referent to determinate data. The objective constitution of an actual entity is its terminal determination, considered as a complex of component determinants, by reason of which the actual entity is a datum for the creative advance. The actual entity, on its physical side, is composed of its determinate feelings of its actual world, and on its mental side is originated by its conceptual appetitions. Returning to the correlation of givenness and potentiality, we see that givenness refers to potentiality, and potentiality to givenness. Also, we see that the completion of givenness in actual fact converts the not given for that fact into impossibility for that fact. The individuality of an actual entity involves an exclusive limitation. This element of exclusive limitation is the definiteness essential for the synthetic unity of an actual entity. This synthetic unity forbids the notion of mere addition to the included elements. It is evident that givenness and potentiality are both meaningless apart from a multiplicity of potential entities. These potentialities are the eternal objects. Apart from potentiality and givenness, there can be no nexus of actual things in process of supersession by novel actual things. The alternative is a static monistic universe without unrealized potentialities, since potentiality is then a meaningless term. The scope of the ontological principle is not exhausted by the corollary that decision must be referable to an actual entity. Everything must be somewhere, and here somewhere means some actual entity. Accordingly, the general potentiality of the universe must be somewhere, since it retains its proximate relevance to actual entities for which it is unrealized. This proximate relevance reappears in subsequent concrescence as final causation regulative of the emergence of novelty. This somewhere is the non-temporal actual entity. This proximate relevance means relevance as in the primordial mind of God. It is a contradiction in terms to assume that some explanatory fact can float into the actual world out of non-entity. Non-entity is nothingness. Every explanatory fact refers to the decision and to the efficacy of an actual thing. The notion of subsistence is merely the notion of how eternal objects can be components of the primordial nature of God. This is a question for subsequent discussion, but eternal objects, as in God's primordial nature, constitute the Platonic world of ideas. There is not, however, one entity which is merely the class of all eternal objects. For if we conceive any class of eternal objects, there are additional eternal objects which presuppose that class, but do not belong to it. For this reason, at the beginning of this section, the phrase the multiplicity of Platonic forms was used, instead of the more natural phrase, the class of Platonic forms. A multiplicity is a type of complex thing, which has the unity derivative from some qualification which participates in each of its components severally. But a multiplicity has no unity derivative, merely from its various components. The doctrine just stated that every explanatory fact refers to the decision and to the efficacy of an actual thing, requires discussion in reference to the 9th categorical obligation. This category states that concrescence of each individual actual entity is internally determined and is externally free. The peculiarity of the course of history illustrates the joint relevance of the ontological principle and of this categorical obligation. The evolution of history can be rationalized by the consideration of the determination of successors and antecedents. But on the other hand, the evolution of history is incapable of rationalization because it exhibits a selected flux of participating forms. No reason internal to history can be assigned why that flux of forms, rather than another flux, should have been illustrated. It is true that any flux must exhibit the character of internal determination. So much follows from the ontological principle, but every instance of internal determination assumes that flux up to that point. There is no reason why there could be no alternative flux exhibiting that principle of internal determination. The actual flux presents itself with the character of being merely given. It does not disclose any peculiar character of perfection. On the contrary, the imperfection of the world is the theme of every religion which offers a way of escape, and of every skeptic who deplores the prevailing superstition. The Leibnizian theory of the best of possible worlds is an audacious fudge produced in order to save the face of a creator constructed by contemporary and antecedent theologians. Further, in the case of those actualities whose immediate experience is most completely open to us, namely human beings, the final decision of the immediate subject-superject, constituting the ultimate modification of subjective aim, is the foundation of our experience of responsibility, of approbation, or of disapprobation, of self-approval or of self-reproach, of freedom or emphasis. This element in experience is too large to be put aside merely as misconstruction. It governs the whole tone of human life. It can be illustrated only by striking instances from fact or from fiction. But these instances are only conspicuous illustrations of human experience during each hour and each minute. The ultimate freedom of things lying beyond all determinations was whispered by Galileo. Freedom for the inquisitors to think wrongly, for Galileo to think rightly, and for the world to move in despite of Galileo and inquisitors. The doctrine of the philosophy of organism is that, however far the sphere of efficient causation be pushed in the determination of components of a concrescence, its data, its emotions, its appreciations, its purposes, its phases of subjective aim, beyond the determination of these components, there always remains the final reaction of the self-creative unity of the universe. This final reaction completes the self-creative act by putting the decisive stamp of creative emphasis upon the determinations of efficient cause. Each occasion exhibits its measure of creative emphasis in proportion to its measure of subjective intensity. The absolute standard of such intensity is that of the primordial nature of God, which is neither great nor small because it arises out of no actual world. It has within it no components, which are standards of comparison, but in the temporal world for occasions of relatively slight, experient intensity, their decisions of creative emphasis are individually negligible, compared to the determined components which they receive and transmit. But the final accumulation of all such decisions, the decision of God's nature, and the decisions of all occasions, constitutes that special element in the flux of forms in history, which is given and incapable of rationalization, beyond the fact that within it every component which is determinable is internally determined. The doctrine is that each concrescence is to be referred to a definite free initiation and a definite free conclusion. The initial fact is macrocosmic, in the sense of having equal relevance to all occasions. The final fact is microcosmic, in the sense of being peculiar to that occasion. Neither fact is capable of rationalization in the sense of tracing the antecedents which determine it. The initial fact is the primordial appetition, and the final fact is the decision of emphasis, finally creative of the satisfaction. The antithetical terms universals and particulars are the usual words employed to denote, respectively, entities which nearly, though not quite, correspond to the entities here termed eternal objects and actual entities. These terms, universals and particulars, both in the suggestiveness of the two words and in their current philosophical use, are somewhat misleading. The ontological principle and the wider doctrine of universal relativity, on which the present metaphysical discussion is founded, blur the sharp distinction between what is universal and what is particular. The notion of a universal is of that which can enter into the description of many particulars, whereas the notion of a particular is that it is described by universals, and does not itself enter into the description of any other particular, according to the doctrine of relativity, which is the basis of the metaphysical system of the present lectures. Both these notions involve a misconception. An actual entity cannot be described, even inadequately, by universals, because other actual entities do enter into the description of any one actual entity. Thus, every so-called universal is particular in the sense of being just what it is, diverse from everything else, and every so-called particular is universal in the sense of entering into the constitutions of other actual entities. The contrary opinion led to the collapse of Descartes' many substances into Spinoza's one substance, to Leibniz's windowless monads with their pre-established harmony, to the skeptical reduction of Hume's philosophy, a reduction first effected by Hume himself. The point is that the current view of universals and particulars inevitably leads to the epistemological position stated by Descartes. Quoting Descartes, "From this I should conclude that I knew the wax by means of vision and not simply by the intuition of the mind, unless by chance. I remember that when looking from a window and saying I see men who pass in the street, I really do not see them, but infer that what I see is men, just as I say that I see wax. And yet what do I see from the window but hats and coats, which may cover automatic machines? Yet I judge these to be men, and similarly solely by the faculty of judgment which rests in my mind. I comprehend that which I believed I saw with my eyes." End of quote. In this passage, it is assumed that Descartes, the ego in question, is a particular characterized only by universals. Thus his impressions, to use Hume's words, are characterizations by universals. Thus there is no perception of a particular actual entity. He arrives at the belief in the actual entity by the faculty of judgment. But on this theory he has absolutely no analogy upon which to found any such inference, with the faintest shred of probability. Hume, accepting Descartes' account of perception, in this passage, which also belongs to Locke in some sections of his essay, easily draws the skeptical conclusion. The philosophy of organism recurs to Descartes' alternative theory of realitas objectiva, and endeavors to interpret it in terms of a consistent ontology. Descartes endeavored to combine the two theories, but his unquestioned acceptance of the subject-predicate dogma forced him into a representative theory of perception, involving a judicum validated by our assurance of the power and the goodness of God. The philosophy of organism in its account of prehension takes its stand upon the Cartesian terms realitas objectiva, inspectio, and intuito. The two latter terms are transformed into a notion of a positive prehension, and into operations described in the various categories of physical and conceptual origination. A recurrence to the notion of God is still necessary to mediate between physical and conceptual prehensions, but not in the crude form of giving a limited letter of credit to a judicium. Hume, in effect, agrees that mind is a process of concrescence arising from primary data. In his account, these data are impressions of sensation, and in such impressions no elements other than universals are discoverable. For the philosophy of organism, the primary data are always actual entities absorbed into feeling in virtue of certain universals shared alike by the objectified actuality and the experienced subject. Descartes takes an intermediate position. He explains perception in Humean terms, but adds an apprehension of particular actual entities in virtue of an inspectio and a judicium affected by the mind. Here he is paving the way for Kant and for the degradation of the world into mere appearance. All modern philosophy hinges around the difficulty of describing the world in terms of subject and predicate, substance and quality, particular and universal. The result always does violence to that immediate experience which we express in our actions, our hopes, our sympathies, our purposes, and which we enjoy in spite of our lack of phrases for its verbal analysis. We find ourselves in a buzzing world amid a democracy of fellow creatures, whereas under some disguise or other, orthodox philosophy can only introduce us to solitary substances, each enjoying an illusory experience. O bottom, thou art changed. What do I see on thee? The endeavor to interpret experience in accordance with the overpowering deliverance of common sense must bring us back to some restatement of Platonic realism modified, so as to avoid the pitfalls which the philosophical investigations of the 17th and 18th centuries have disclosed. The true point of divergence is the false notion suggested by the contrast between the natural meanings of the words particular and universal. The particular is thus conceived as being just its individual self, with no necessary relevance to any other particular. It answers to Descartes' definition of substance. Quote, "And when we conceive of substance, we merely conceive an existent thing which requires nothing but itself in order to exist." End quote. This definition is a true derivative from Aristotle's definition, which is, of primary substance is neither asserted of a subject nor present in a subject. We must add the title phrase of Descartes' second meditation, quote, "of the nature of the human mind, and that it is more easily known than the body," end quote. Together with his two statements, quote, "thought constitutes the nature of thinking substance," end quote, "everything that we find in mind is but so many diverse forms of thinking," end quote. This sequence of quotations exemplifies the set of presuppositions which led to Locke's empiricism and to Kant's critical philosophy, the two dominant influences from which modern thought is derived. This is the side of 17th century philosophy which is here discarded. The principle of universal relativity directly traverses Aristotle's dictum, quote, "a substance is not present in a subject," end quote. On the contrary, according to this principle, an actual entity is present in other actual entities. In fact, if we allow for degrees of relevance and for negligible relevance, we must say that every actual entity is present in every other actual entity. The philosophy of organism is mainly devoted to the task of making clear the notion of being present in another entity. This phrase is here borrowed from Aristotle. It is not a fortunate phrase, and in subsequent discussion it will be replaced by the term objectification, quote unquote. The Aristotelian phrase suggests the crude notion that one actual entity is added to another simpliciter. This is not what is meant. One role of the eternal objects is that they are those elements which express how any one actual entity is constituted by its synthesis of other actual entities, and how that actual entity develops from the primary dative phase into its own individual actual existence, involving its individual enjoyments and appetitions. An actual entity is concrete because it is such a particular concrescence of the universe. A short examination of Locke's essay concerning human understanding will throw light on the presuppositions from which the philosophy of organism originates. The first point to notice is that in some of his statements, Locke comes very near to the explicit formulation of an organic philosophy of the type being developed here. It was only his failure to notice that his problem required a more drastic revision of traditional categories than that which he actually effected, and that led to a vagueness of statement and the intrusion of inconsistent elements. It was this conservative other side of Locke which led to his skeptical overthrow by Hume. In his turn, Hume was a thorough conservative, and in his explanation of mentality and its content never moved away from the subject-predicate habits of thought, which had been impressed on the European mind by the overemphasis on Aristotle's logic during the long medieval period. In reference to this twist of mind, probably Aristotle was not an Aristotelian, but Hume's skeptical reduction of knowledge entirely depends for its arguments on the tacit presupposition of the mind as subject and of its contents as predicates, a presupposition which explicitly he repudiates. The merit of Locke's essay concerning human understanding is its adequacy and not its consistency. He gives the most dispassionate descriptions of those various elements in experience which common sense never lets slip. Unfortunately, he is hampered by inappropriate metaphysical categories which he never criticized. He should have widened the title of his book into An Essay Concerning Experience. This true topic is the analysis of the types of experience enjoyed by an actual entity. But this complete experience is nothing other than what the actual entity is in itself for itself. I will adopt the pre-Kantian phraseology and say that the experience enjoyed by an actual entity is that entity formaliter. By this I mean that the entity, when considered formally, is being described in respect to those forms of its constitution whereby it is that individual entity with its own measure of absolute self-realization. Its ideas of things, quote unquote, are what other things are for it. In the phraseology of these lectures, they are its feelings, quote unquote. The actual entity is composite and analyzable, and its ideas express how and in what sense other things are components in its own constitution. Thus the form of its constitution is to be found by an analysis of the Lockean ideas. Locke talks of understanding and perception. He should have started with a more general, neutral term to express the synthetic concrescence, whereby the many things of the universe become the one actual entity. Accordingly, I have adopted the term prehension to express the activity whereby an actual entity affects its own concretion of other things. The prehension of one actual entity by another actual entity is the complete transaction analyzable into the objectification of the former entity as one of the data for the latter, and into the fully clothed feeling whereby the datum is absorbed into the subjective satisfaction clothed with the various elements of its subjective form. But this definition can be stated more generally so as to include the case of the prehension of an eternal object by an actual entity, namely the positive prehension of an entity by an actual entity is the complete transaction analyzable into the ingression or objectification of that entity as a datum for feeling and into the feeling whereby this datum is absorbed into the subjective satisfaction. I also discard Locke's term idea, instead of that term the other things and their limited roles, as elements for the actual entity in question are called objects for that thing. There are four main types of objects, namely eternal objects, propositions, objectified actual entities, and nexus. These eternal objects are Locke's ideas as explained in his essay, where he writes, "Idea is the object of thinking, every man being conscious to himself that he thinks, and that which his mind is applied about, whilst thinking, being the ideas that are there, it is past doubt that men have in their mind several ideas, such as those expressed by the words whiteness, hardness, sweetness, thinking, motion, man, elephant, army, drunkenness, and others." But later, when discussing general terms and subconsciously, earlier in the discussion of substance, he adds parenthetically another type of ideas which are practically what I term objectified actual entities and nexus. He calls them ideas of particular things, and he explains why, in general, such ideas cannot have their separate names. The reason is simple and undeniable. There are too many actual entities, he writes, but it is beyond the power of human capacity to frame and retain distinct ideas of all the particular things we meet with, every bird and beast men saw, every tree and plant that affected the senses could not find a place in the most capacious understanding. The context shows that it is not the impossibility of an idea of any particular thing which is the seat of the difficulty, it is solely their number. This notion of a direct idea or feeling of an actual entity is a presupposition of all common sense, but it accords very ill with the sensationalist theory of knowledge which can be derived from other parts of Locke's writings. Both Locke and Descartes wrestle with exactly the same difficulty. The principle that I am adopting is that consciousness presupposes experience, and not experience consciousness. It is a special element in the subjective forms of some feelings. Thus, an actual entity may or may not be conscious of some part of its experience. Its experience is its complete formal constitution, including its consciousness, if any. Thus, in Locke's phraseology, its ideas of particular things, quote unquote, are those other things exercising their function as felt components of its constitution. Locke would only term them ideas when these objectifications belong to that region of experience lit up by consciousness. In section 3 of the same chapter, he definitely makes all knowledge to be founded in particular things. For Locke, there are not first the qualities and then the conjectural particular things, but conversely. Locke has in fact stated in his work one main problem for the philosophy of organism. He discovers that the mind is a unity arising out of the active prehension of ideas into one concrete thing. Unfortunately, he presupposes both the Cartesian dualism whereby minds are one kind of particulars and natural entities are another kind of particulars, and also the subject-predicate dogma. He is thus in company with Descartes, driven to a theory of representative perception. Representative perception can never, within its own metaphysical doctrines, produce the very title deeds to guarantee the validity of the representation of fact by idea. Locke and the philosophers of his epoch, the 17th and 18th centuries, are misled by one fundamental misconception. It is the assumption, unconscious and uncriticized, that logical simplicity can be identified with priority in the process constituting an experient occasion. This identification of priority in logic with priority in practice has vitiated thought and procedure from the first discovery of mathematics and logic by the Greeks. Locke's nearest approach to the philosophy of organism, and from the point of view of that doctrine, his main oversight, are best exemplified by the first section of his chapter. He writes, "The mind being, and I have declared, furnished with a great number of the simple ideas conveyed in by the senses, as they are found in exterior things or by reflection on its own operations, takes notice also that a certain number of these simple ideas go constantly together, which being presumed to belong to one thing, and words being suited to common apprehensions, and made use of for quick dispatch, are called, so united in one subject by one name, which by inadvertency we are apt afterward to talk of and consider as one simple idea, which indeed is a complication of many ideas together, because, as I have said, not imagining how these simple ideas can subsist by themselves, we accustom ourselves to suppose some substratum wherein they do subsist, and from which they do result, which therefore we call substance." In this section, Locke's first statement, which is the basis of the remainder of the section, is exactly the primary assumption of the philosophy of organism. The mind, being furnished with a great number of the simple things conveyed in by the senses as they are found in exterior things. Here the last phrase, "as they are found in exterior things," asserted what later I shall call the vector character of the primary feelings. The universals involved obtain that status by reason of the fact that they are found in exterior things. This is Locke's assertion, and it is the assertion of the philosophy of organism. It can also be conceived as a development of Descartes' doctrine of realitas objectiva. The universals are the only elements in the data describable by concepts, because concepts are merely the analytic functioning of universals, but the exterior things, although they are not expressible by concepts in respect to their individual particularity, are no less data for feeling, so that the concrescent actuality arises from feeling their status of individual particularity, and thus that particularity is included as an element from which feelings originate, in which they concern. The sentence later proceeds with, "a certain number of these simple ideas go constantly together." This can only mean that in the immediate perception, a certain number of these simple ideas are found together in an exterior thing, and that the recollection of antecedent moments of experience discloses that the same fact of togetherness in an exterior thing holds for the same set of simple ideas. Again, the philosophy of organism agrees that this description is true for moments of immediate experience. But Locke, owing to the fact that he veils his second premise under the phrase "go constantly together," omits to consider the question whether the exterior things of the successive moments are to be identified. The answer of the philosophy of organism is that, in the sense in which Locke is here speaking, the exterior things of successive moments are not to be identified with each other. Each exterior thing is either one actual entity, or more frequently is a nexus of actual entities with immediacies mutually contemporary. For the sake of simplicity, we will speak only of the simpler case, where the exterior thing means one actual entity at the moment in question. But what Locke is explicitly concerned with is the notion of the self-identity, of the one enduring physical body which lasts for years or for seconds or for ages. He is considering the current philosophical notion of an individualized particular substance in the Aristotelian sense, which undergoes adventures of change, retaining its substantial form amid transition or accidents. Throughout his essay, he in effect retains this notion while rightly insisting on its vagueness and obscurity. The philosophy of organism agrees with Locke and Hume that the non-individualized substantial form is nothing else than the collection of universals, or more accurately, the one complex universal common to the succession of exterior things at successive moments respectively. In other words, an exterior thing is either one actual entity or is a society with a defining characteristic. For the organic philosophy, these exterior things, in the former sense, are the final concrete actualities. The individualized substance of Locke must be construed to be the historic route constituted by some society of fundamental exterior things stretching from the first thing to the last thing. But Locke, throughout his essay, rightly insists that the chief ingredient in the notion of substance is the notion of power. The philosophy of organism holds that in order to understand power, we must have a correct notion of how each individual actual entity contributes to the datum from which its successors arise and to which they must conform. The reason why the doctrine of power is peculiarly relevant to the enduring things, which the philosophy of Locke's day conceived as individualized substances, is that any likeness between the successive occasions of a historic root procures a corresponding identity between their contributions to the datum of any subsequent actual entity, and it therefore secures a corresponding intensification in the imposition of conformity. The principle is the same as that which holds for the more sporadic occasions in empty space, but the uniformity along the historic route increases the degree of conformity which that route exacts from the future. In particular, each historic route of like occasions tends to prolong itself by reason of the weight of uniform inheritance derivable from its members. The philosophy of organism abolishes the detached mind. Mental activity is one of the modes of feeling belonging to all actual entities, in some degree, but only amounting to conscious intellectuality in some actual entities. This higher grade of mental activity is the intellectual self-analysis of the entity in an earlier stage of incompletion, affected by intellectual feelings produced in a later stage of concrescence. The perceptive constitution of the actual entity presents the problem: how can the other actual entities, each with its own formal existence, also enter objectively into the perceptive constitution of the actual entity in question? This is the problem of the solidarity of the universe. The classical doctrines of universals and particulars of subject and predicate, of individual substances not present in other individual substances, of the externality of relations alike render this problem incapable of solution. The answer given by the organic philosophy is the doctrine of prehensions, involved in concrescent integrations, and terminating in a definite, complex unity of feeling. To be actual must mean that all actual things are alike objects, enjoying objective immortality, in fashioning creative actions, and that all actual things are subjects, each prehending the universe from which it arises. The creative action is the universe always becoming one in a particular unity of self-experience, and thereby adding to the multiplicity, which is the universe as many. This insistent concrescence into unity is the outcome of the ultimate self-identity of each entity. No entity, be it universal or particular, can play disjointed roles. Self-identity requires that every entity have one conjoined self-consistent function, whatever be the complexity of that function. There is another side to Locke, which is his doctrine of power. This doctrine is a better illustration of his admirable adequacy than of his consistency. There is no escape from Hume's demonstration that no such doctrine is compatible with a purely sensationalist philosophy. Locke introduces his doctrine of power as follows, quote, "This idea how got, the mind being every day informed by the senses of the alteration of those simple ideas it observes in things without, and taking notice how one comes to an end, and ceases to be, and another begins to exist, which was not before, reflecting also on what passes within itself, and observing a constant change of its ideas, sometimes by the impression of outward objects on the senses, and sometimes by the determination of its own choice, and concluding, from what it has so constantly observed to have been, that the like changes will for the future be made in the same thing, by like agents, and by the like ways, considers in one thing the possibility of having any of its simple ideas changed, and in another the possibility of making that change, and so comes by that idea which we call power. Thus we say fire has a power to melt gold, and gold has a power to be melted, in which in like cases the power we consider is in reference to the change of perceivable ideas, for we cannot observe any alteration to be made in, or operation upon anything, but by the observable change of its sensible ideas, nor conceive any alteration to be made, but by conceiving a change of some of its ideas. Power thus considered is twofold, viz., as able to make or able to receive any change. The one may be called active, and the other passive power. I confess power includes in it some kind of relation, a relation to action or change, as indeed, which of our ideas of what kind soever, when attentively considered, does not. For our ideas of extension, duration, and number, do they not all contain in them a secret relation of the parts? Figure and motion have something relative in them, much more visibly, and sensible qualities as colors and smells, etc. What are they but the powers of different bodies in relation to our perception? Our idea, therefore, of power, I think, may well have a place amongst other simple ideas, and be considered as one of them, being one of those that makes a principal ingredient in our complex ideas of substances, as we shall hereafter have occasion to observe. In this important passage, Locke enunciates the main doctrines of the philosophy of organism, namely the principle of relativity, the relational character of eternal objects, whereby they constitute the forms of the objectifications of actual entities for each other, the composite character of an actual entity, i.e. a substance, the notion of power as making a principal ingredient in that of actual entity, substance, In this latter notion, Locke adumbrates both the ontological principle and also the principle that the power of an actual entity on the other is simply how the former is objectified in the constitution of the other. Thus the problem of perception and the problem of power are one and the same, at least so far as perception is reduced to mere prehension of actual entities. Perception in the sense of consciousness of such prehension requires the additional factor of the conceptual prehension of eternal objects and a process of integration of the two factors. Locke's doctrine of power is reproduced in the philosophy of organism by the doctrine of the two types of objectification, namely A. Causal objectification and B. Presentational objectification. In causal objectification, what is felt subjectively by the objectified actual entity is transmitted objectively to the concrescent actualities which supersede it. In Locke's phraseology, the objectified actual entity is then exerting power. In this type of objectification, the eternal objects, relational between object and subject, express the formal constitution of the objectified actual entity. In presentational objectification, the relational eternal objects fall into two sets, one set contributed by the extensive perspective of the perceived from the position of the perceiver, and the other set by the antecedent concrescent phases of the perceiver. What is ordinarily termed perception is consciousness of presentational objectification, but according to the philosophy of organism, there can be consciousness of both types of objectification. There can be such consciousness of both types because, according to this philosophy, the knowable is the complete nature of the knower, at least such phases of it as are antecedent to that operation of knowing. Locke misses one essential doctrine, namely, that the doctrine of internal relations makes it impossible to attribute change to any actual entity. Every actual entity is what it is, and is with its definite status in the universe, determined by its internal relations to other actual entities. Change is the description of the adventures of eternal objects in the evolving universe of actual things. The doctrine of internal relations introduces another consideration which cannot be overlooked without error. Locke considers the real essence and the nominal essence of things, but on the theory of the general relativity of actual things between each other, and of the internality of these relations, there are two distinct notions, hidden under the term real essence, both of importance. Locke writes, quote, "Essence may be taken for the being of anything, whereby it is what it is, and thus the real internal, but generally in substances unknown, constitution of things, whereon their discoverable qualities depend, may be called their essence. It is true, there is ordinarily supposed a real constitution of this sort of things, and it is past doubt there must be some real constitution on which any collection of simple ideas coexisting must depend. But it being evident that things are ranked under names into sorts, or species only as they agree to certain abstract ideas to which we have annexed these names, the essence of each genus, or sort, comes to be nothing but that abstract idea, which the general, or sortal, if I may have leave to so call it from sort, as I do general from genus, name stands for. This we shall find to be that which the word essence imparts in its familiar use. These two sorts of essences, I suppose, may not unfitly be termed, the one the real, the other the nominal essence. The fundamental notion of the philosophy of organism is expressed in Locke's phrase, "It is past doubt there must be some real constitution on which any collection of simple ideas coexisting must depend." Locke makes it plain that by a simple idea he means the ingression in the actual entity, illustrated by a piece of wax, a piece of ice, a rose, of some abstract quality which is not complex, illustrated by softness, warmth, whiteness. For Locke, such simple ideas coexisting in an actual entity require a real constitution for that entity. Now, in the philosophy of organism, passing beyond Locke's explicit statement, the notion of a real constitution is taken to mean that the eternal objects function by introducing the multiplicity of actual entities as constitutive of the actual entity in question. Thus, the constitution is real because it assigns its status in the real world to the actual entity. In other words, the actual entity, in virtue of being what it is also where it is. It is somewhere because it is some actual thing, with its correlated actual world. This is the direct denial of the Cartesian doctrine, an existent thing which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. It is also inconsistent with Aristotle's phrase, "neither asserted of a subject nor present in a subject." I am certainly not maintaining that Locke grasped explicitly the implications of his words as thus developed for the philosophy of organism. But it is a short step from a careless phrase to a flash of insight, nor is it unbelievable that Locke saw further into metaphysical problems than some of his followers. But abandoning the question of what Locke had in his own mind, the organic doctrine demands a real essence in the sense of a complete analysis of the relations and interrelations of the actual entities which are formative of the actual entity in question, and an abstract essence in which the specified actual entities are replaced by the notions of unspecified entities in such a combination. This is the notion of an unspecified actual entity. Thus, the real essence involves real objectifications of specified actual entities. The abstract essence is a complex, eternal object. There is nothing self-contradictory in the thought of many actual entities with the same abstract essence, but there can be one actual entity with the same real essence, for the real essence indicates where the entity is, that is to say, its status in the real world. The abstract essence omits the particularity of this status. The philosophy of organism in its appeal to the facts can thus support itself by an appeal to the insight of John Locke, who in British philosophy is the analogue to Plato in the epoch of his life, in personal endowments, in width of experience, and in dispassionate statement of conflicting intuitions. This doctrine of organism is the attempt to describe the world as a process of generation and individual actual entities, each with its own absolute self-attainment. This concrete finality of the individual is nothing else than a decision referent beyond itself. The perpetual perishing of individual absoluteness is thus foredoomed, but the perishing of absoluteness is the attainment of objective immortality. This last conception expresses the further element in the doctrine of organism, that the process of generation is to be described in terms of actual entities.